As more shoppers choose electric for their next vehicle purchase, the Hyundai Ioniq 5 proved to be one of the top-selling electric vehicles in the United States in 2023. Now, if you take the top two out of the equation, the Model 3 and the Model Y, which are ahead by quite a margin, this moves just that much closer to the top. And if you put it head-to-head against its direct rivals, it gets that much closer. But that doesn't mean that Hyundai did nothing for 2024. They have in fact made a few upgrades that are going to keep it not just competitive, but also moving forward in terms of safety. And there's a special Disney edition, which is either a can't miss or couldn't care less. The first thing you'll notice here at the front of the car is going to be the signature daytime LED running lights, and that's going to be the square, rectangular, pixel, 8-bit style that we get here on the inner and outer end of this lens. Now, inside of these daytime running lamps, you will find projector LED headlights, but these are not the only lights you'll find at the front. They are certainly the most obvious, but in the little chin section that we find here just beneath these lights, you'll also find lighting that's a lot more visible at night or just as it gets darker than you will be able to see right now. This light chin doesn't run completely uninterrupted from side to side of the vehicle. It is broken up here in the middle with a black stripe. But on this particular trim, the black stripe is actually a charging indicator. It will have different levels depending on how charged your vehicle is so that you can see it from a glance across the parking lot, maybe from Starbucks, just to give you some indication of where your vehicle is charged up at. Here in the lower section of the bumper, we will find these two large open vents that are currently open because I have the air conditioning running inside. But when they are not needing to be open, they will go ahead and close. And that's going to make sure that you have the right amount of cooling that the vehicle needs, not just for the air going into the cabin, but also for the battery. But if that cooling isn't necessary, it's not adding any more drag than is needed as well. While this isn't as square as it may seem on first glance, there are still significant efforts being made to make sure that this is as slippery going down the road as possible to add to the overall range, because the battery sizes are not limited just for this vehicle, but this is Hyundai trying to make sure they're getting the most out of the battery that's in the vehicle and that you as the consumer are getting the most out of the electricity that you put into it. Moving around to the side profile, we see one of my absolute favorite shapes in automotive history, which is that of the traditional hatchback, and in this case, a 5-door. But the looks here are a little misleading, because in my mind, the traditional hatchback is something like a Volkswagen Golf, which still exists but has changed a little bit in overall shape. This, however, is a whole lot bigger than a traditional Golf. We're looking at 182.5 inches long and a wheelbase of 118.1 inches, which is what allows it to take this shape, because the proportions of this are traditional hatchback, but the size is so much bigger. And the reason we're getting that look is because this is an electric vehicle and we need to fit a battery under here, and that battery has to fit somewhere, and the larger battery being over 75 kilowatt hours means it needs somewhere to go. Now, with a width of 74.4 inches, that also helps round out this look. So if you see one going by on the road, my first thought is compact car, subcompact vehicle by today's standards, but this is a lot bigger. I was slightly disappointed when this came out that it wasn't smaller, but if it was smaller, it would probably sell in a lot smaller numbers. So it makes sense, I accept it. I still get to see my favorite shape on the road. It's just a little bit bigger than I had anticipated. But the most obvious rounding on the shape of this vehicle, and that's going to be coming across down the rear hatch. Now, I do apologize for not having a cleaner car. Unfortunately, I don't have nearly as much time with this model as I would like to. I've got a lot of miles to put on it and not a whole lot of time. So I didn't have a chance to clean it up as much as I would like to. But in terms of cleaning the rear glass, you're also not going to be able to do that as quickly as you would like because there is no rear windshield wiper. Moving below the rear slope, we have a great implementation of copy-paste from the front end. Now obviously the back end here is a lot taller than what we find at the very front of the vehicle, so we are going to see some differences. But where we used to have these squared daytime running lights, we now have our squared red lights, and our brake light, this will go ahead and light up from the inside. You can see over here we have it lighting up as our turn signal. I think this is very beautifully integrated, and if you're wondering where the reverse lights are, they aren't going to be found down here. They're actually built into these 4 pixels right here that you have to look very closely to notice the difference, but again, again, I think a beautiful implementation of that. We have the same center black stripe here that we found in the front, though this will not tell you your charging capacity. And below that, the chin that we saw below that had the vertical stripes and the lights illuminating from underneath of those are not going to be found here because frankly, I think that would just be too much light for the back of the car, but we do still see the elements in place. Under the hood, you find just about exactly what you should expect, which is not a whole lot. One of the best things about this platform is that it was designed to be electric and be efficient. That's efficient in fuel economy, that's efficient in power implementation, and that's also efficient in space. We do not have an enormous engine bay here, and so there shouldn't be a whole lot of extra room. And even though this is the dual motor model, meaning there is a motor tucked down here, obviously that motor is a lot smaller than a traditional engine, meaning the fact that under here we only have a tiny bit of storage, a few takeout containers perhaps. This is still something that I am totally okay with because we don't have a much bigger overhang, and that means that when you're driving around, you know where your edges are. And again, coming from the preference of a compact hatchback, I like to know where my edges are and not have a big hulking vehicle, at least not feel like I do. Besides the underhood packaging, there's some other packaging to talk about, and that is the powertrains. This comes in 3 distinct powertrains, 2 rear-wheel drive, 1 all-wheel drive with 2 total battery sizes. Starting on the lowest rung of the ladder with the SE standard range, we get a 58 kilowatt-hour battery with a total driving range of 220 miles and an engine output, a rear motor output, of 168 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. Moving up to the larger battery, we're using the same motor, but we get a little bit more oomph out of it. Same 258 pound-feet of torque, but up to 225 horsepower and an increased driving range of 303 miles. So that is going to be over 80 miles that you get and a little bit more horsepower. The dual motor all-wheel drive is the one you're interested in. You're looking at a total horsepower output of 320 and a pound-foot torque of 446 and 260 miles of driving range. So the range falls between the 2 rear-wheel drive options, but obviously you're getting all-wheel drive and quite a bit more power. That is still coming from that 77.4 kilowatt-hour battery, which is about 200 pounds heavier just in the battery than the lower battery option. Obviously, those different powertrain combinations will produce different results as far as efficiency goes, and with our rear-wheel drive small battery, we get an overall MPGe combined of 110. If we move up to the larger battery, which is about 200 pounds heavier just in the battery, we're going to move up from 110 to 114, and then as we keep the big battery but add a motor and a lot more power, as one would expect, we are going to drop down to 99 mile per gallon equivalent. Now, overall, these numbers make a whole lot of sense, except for those 2 rear-wheel drive models. Right now, I've got just about a week's or so worth of luggage tucked here in the back without a whole lot of planning. So as you can see here, when we open this up, we do get the lights that stay on both ends, but I have 3 carry-on size pieces of luggage here without, again, arranging them in any particular fashion. I could very easily squeeze a little bit more in here, and in our roller bag test, we were able to fit 4 total bags back here without a whole lot of issue. The one thing we do run into is that this space is not overly tall, and that is going to be mostly because of the shape of the rear hatch, but it's not something that's going to, I think, affect your daily use of it because it's such a wide opening that unless you have a very specific tall use case, it shouldn't be much of an issue. Now, this particular model came with a cargo cover, and if we slide that forward, it is going to cover everything I just had underneath, including the expanded roller bag I had with me. And this here will not unfortunately fit right between the wheel well there, so if you do want to take it out, it's not going to be as convenient as you might find elsewhere, but you do find just enough storage space down below to put your tire mobility kit and the charge cable that's going to come with the vehicle. Moving on to the interior, you'll find things a little simpler inside than you do outside. From the upper portion down to just below the center armrest, things here are going to be relatively soft touch, with this being much more of a clear plastic spot with a checkered pixelated design here down along the door. Below this is going to be hard plastic with a little cubby there, just enough size for a water bottle and perhaps a small book if you want to carry one with you. In the door, you'll find just a few things: your door handle here and your switches, so lock and unlock, as well as your window switch. And then down below, outlined here in a blue light, is the Bose speaker. The Bose system here is fairly subtly integrated, but again, I think that goes with the rest of the theme here with things being relatively simple. Up along the dash, we'll find one singular stitch design up here at the top. Below that, you'll find a grate that looks somewhat similar to what we'll find on the exterior, and then it's going to include the air vent here. If you do want all of your lines in a row, then you want to make sure that you're pointing it the right direction. Below this, we have a slot style bin, but with another compartment here. I like the fact that we've built a little bit more storage here into the door, but it just depends on how much you utilize the space. Overall, there is quite a bit of it. Currently, there is a wide open area from the center console to the cubby up above, but if I don't want this open area, for whatever reason, I can simply slide the whole center console forward. And that center console does include the armrest, so that may be one of the main reasons to do so if you want to reposition the armrest. It also might make it easier, depending on where your seat is located, to go ahead and access something like your Qi wireless charging pad, which is going to be down below. This little storage cubby here isn't going to fit a modern phone, but whatever you may want to slide in here, maybe it's a couple coins, you could do so. You'll also find more charging for the driver and passenger. That's going to be a USB-A on both the left and right side. But your main USB is going to be up here in front of this little cubby. Now in this location, the USB port is going to be not just for charging, but for your wired Android Auto and Apple CarPlay use. It's not my favorite location for a connection like that, but you could tuck your phone in this cubby if you wanted to. It just means you have to reach forward. If you don't do that, it means that you're going to have a cable running from there all the way up to presumably wherever you keep your phone in this center console. Up above that forward cubby, we'll find the main infotainment display. This is going to be a very large display that perfectly matches the one on the driver's side, but from here you can get just about anything you need, and it is usable while you're driving. You can have your EV screen to check in on a number of different functions, including how far you can go right now with your climate control on or off. So if you're ever curious how efficient that system is running, you can always check there. You're also able to do things like access your phone projection. That's your Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. And you can access a lot of these menus from the lower button bank down here. Now, depending on the light situation, it may be difficult to see those. And so while you're driving, you're probably not going to be rotating through them very often, but it is something to note that if you don't want to touch the screen, then you're going to have to use these buttons to navigate some of those menus. The star button here is a programmable one, and so most folks, I imagine, would use it for their phone projection. That just makes it a little bit easier, and you have one of those on the steering wheel as well. Now, one unusual piece here is that if you click on climate, you'll see that the screen changes to essentially the same button bank that you have just a little bit further down. So I don't know why you would want to do this one way or the other, but I suppose you do have the option for both. If you do click on the warmer button down here, you'll see that it brings you to another screen, this one to be your heated or cooled passenger and driver seat. It is nice that it has both of these options available. It's just a little bit annoying you have to go into a menu screen to do so, where in most vehicles, it's a simple button. Here you do also have access to your heated steering wheel, but again, it's not the easiest to get to. Moving away from our infotainment screen, we see the driver display, which is in the same housing and is the same shape, but a disconnected screen instead of one continuous screen going all the way across. And from here, there are a number of things you can change. If you switch your drive mode, you'll notice that the graphics on the sides are going to change, presumably to fit the mood, this being Eco, Normal, and Sport. We'll slide over to normal, and you can also make changes to the information in the middle of the screen. So you have drive information, your navigation, essentially which direction you're pointing if you don't have a specific route in mind, some more vehicle information such as tire pressures and how much energy is being used or gained from the separate motors, and ultimately our driving display screen, which is going to give us not a lot of information, but if you want to check our attention level or when our last break was, we have information available to us there. If you don't like staring down at a display screen, don't worry, there is a heads-up display, and this will show quite a bit of information, including vehicles in your blind spot and an augmented reality mode, which mostly relies on using the vehicle's turn-by-turn navigation, and that's something that I don't think a lot of folks will, because most new car buyers tend to like their Android Auto or Apple CarPlay. Now for the drivers themselves, we have a very nicely laid out steering wheel that has a unique feature that reminds me of something like the old BlackBerry Storm. Each of the buttons here on the steering wheel is sort of a two-stage process. You select which button you want to press, and that is touch capacitive, but to actually activate it, you will click. And that's when the car knows what button you're trying to press, and then knows whether or not or when to engage it. The drive mode selector is here on the bottom left, and our fabric insert here in the middle also has our 4 dots indicating the Hyundai, or H for Hyundai, in Morse code. One of the other treats the steering wheel provides, besides being a nice shape with some good finger grips, is that we have paddle shifters here. But these paddle shifters are to change the regenerative braking. If I zoom in here on the screen, you can see level 3 is currently activated. Pressing the right paddle will go ahead and decrease my regenerative braking. The left paddle will increase it all the way up to an I-pedal system, which is going to integrate the brakes and the regenerative braking with just the use of the brake pedal. Moving over to the driver's door, you'll see the addition of a few more switches, all still here in silver. That's going to be your added window switches, window lockout, and left and right mirrors. One more thing we'll see here in the top trim is that we have position seating memory, so driver 1 and driver 2. Here in the back seats, you'll see not only a lot of space, but a similar look and feel. It's very much added to the spaciousness of that cabin with the large opening there for the moonroof. Behind the center console, and this is the sliding console, and I have it all the way forward, you'll see that in the rear, you do get 2 USB ports. Here behind the seats, we have a mesh net pocket, and we do have a fold-down armrest with 2 cup holders as well. So just about all the amenities you need in the back seat are going to be found here. Now let's talk about the Hyundai Ioniq 5 out on the road. And one of the first things you may notice is just how readily available power is. Now I have this car in normal mode, climbing a slight hill, but as soon as I put my foot down, there is power within about half a second. And the only reason there's about a half a second delay is because the power here really ramps up, but it ramps up quickly. And if I want it to ramp up more quickly, I could simply dial it up to sport mode. If you have an eco mode, obviously it's going to be a different experience, but that's because this is one of the more complex eco modes. Because off the line, you'll still have both motors available. It'll actually disconnect that front axle and make it a almost strictly rear wheel drive. Now, obviously, if you find yourself in a slippery condition or the vehicle needs a little bit more power at higher speed, then it's going to re-engage that motor. But the fact that you can dial this in back and forth really helps not just the individual get what they want out of it, but it's also something to consider if you share this vehicle, so that driver 1, driver 2, and driver 3 can all have the tuned experience that they want, whether they're on the more aggressive, assertive side of things, or they like to sit back, cruise on their way to and from work. Now, unfortunately, while I had this vehicle, I didn't have access to our normal testing roads, nor did I have access to all of our equipment. So all I can tell you is that this is very quick. It is 0 to 60 under 4.5 seconds, but I'll go ahead and post the manufacturer time above. I just unfortunately wasn't able to test it. Another thing I wasn't able to do without our equipment is test the braking. But last time we did test this, it came in at about 120 feet from 60 down to 0. And my guess is that we're going to be falling very much within those same parameters. The braking on here is more than sufficient for what you're going to be doing on your daily commute or a fun twisty back road. And a lot of that's going to be down to the strong regenerative braking plus the wide tires, and the way those all combine is for a very smooth experience as well. So panic braking is something that most folks won't have to do, and that's a good thing. But when you do, you have everything working for you in this vehicle, certainly not working against. Now, with basic forward motion out of the way, let's talk about how this car really drives. This suspension is very well built to handle the weight of this vehicle. And that's not something that we always have to worry about in a crossover, especially a mid-sized crossover, because they're built to handle the car that's on top of it. But in an electric vehicle, one of the things we find is that the size of the car usually sees an increase in mass versus its gasoline counterparts, and that's because we have a lot of batteries on board. And in this case, 77.4 kilowatt hours makes for a heavy battery pack. But what we don't see here that we do in some other models like Tesla or the Mustang Mach-E is that it's not going to be sprung too tightly. If you add weight, you need stiffer springs. And the stiffer springs can be tuned and adjusted by the manufacturer to dictate the kind of ride that you're going to get out of the car. But while this has a little bit more tilt and body roll, the overall grip is very similar to what you'll find in those other vehicles. And those don't necessarily have sport suspensions, and this definitely doesn't have a sport suspension, unless you get the much sportier model, and then that's a very different situation. What you do get here is a comfortable, competent ride for your everyday use, and if that everyday use happens to include a few back roads, then this is not a bad place to be either. When you really throw it into a corner, you're going to notice that those tires keep gripping, that the body may roll, but you're not understeering or getting stuck on a line that you didn't want to be on. And overall, for handling, especially of a vehicle this size, this weight, and this price, I have to give it an A. Now, as I mentioned, it's not nearly as tight of a suspension as we find in some of our other electric competitors, but that's definitely to its advantage on your daily commute, on a road trip, because this is a quiet, comfortable cabin. And a lot of that has to do with how well the body movement is managed with this suspension. For what it is and for the price, I definitely have to say this is an A- as far as the ride, and none of that's a knock. If they had maybe some adjustability within that suspension, I think it could go a little bit higher, but for what it is, it does a great job of balancing all the different components and keeping things relatively affordable. Now, with all the time I've spent in this car in the last few days, I can tell you that this would be a great vehicle to road trip in. One of those reasons is because this is one of the fastest charging cars you can buy in North America right now, even if it doesn't have its own dedicated network. If you don't find yourself doing 8 hours at a time, then chances are you're not going to run into too many charging issues, because there will always be another one not too far down the road. And as long as you plan it around, say, your lunch or dinner breaks, everything should be pretty easy going. But one of the other things that will make that road trip so much more enjoyable is the fact that this is a really isolated experience from some of the harshness or noise that you'll get in a lot of other vehicles. Here in the cabin, everything feels just far enough away from you as it should. It doesn't mean we can't hear anything. There is not loads and loads of acoustic glass or tons of sound deadening material throughout the cabin. This is just a quiet space. Obviously, with an electric car, the fact that the powertrain is making no noise always makes it a little bit more obvious when you get more road noise coming into the cabin or more wind noise. And despite this looking like a very boxy machine, I'm not getting a whole lot of either of those things. There are definitely a lot of things to like about this packaging, but one of the things that I was slightly disappointed in over my couple hundred miles of rather mixed driving was going to be the overall efficiency. This is not some big Hummer electric vehicle, and we are still looking at right around 3 to 3.3 miles per kilowatt hour, but there are a lot of other vehicles that are similar size and relative shape that can do just a bit better. And even amongst the siblings here between the Kia and the Hyundai, the EV6, basically because of its shape, is going to be quite a bit more efficient, especially in your highway driving. Now, since this is such a surprisingly well-handling vehicle for its size, shape, and category, I'll admit that I have put my foot in it more than once, and that's certainly not going to help the fuel economy. But it's also going to be something that I think a lot of people who buy this car are going to do themselves. And on the flip side, a lot of the other driving was at the speed limit in cruise control, usually below 65, maybe 60 miles an hour. So overall, the real world driving has been representative of what you'll find for most people's use case. We'll begin with the Ioniq 5 and we'll go straight to the top, because what this does include is the Disney 100th Anniversary Edition. What it does not include is the Ioniq 5N. Hopefully we do have one of those here in studio that we can test for a week, but it really is going to be a different machine, and it's also going to get a lot of different comparisons to some of the other models out there. When it comes to direct head-to-head comparison, we might as well start with the segment leader, and that's going to be the Tesla Model Y, and it leads those sales by a pretty wide margin. That doesn't mean, however, that the Ioniq 5 doesn't put up a good fight. And as you'll see here, these two trade blows back and forth, and a lot of it is going to be more subjective than you might think. While I think the Model Y is an attractive vehicle, it's definitely been on the more conservative end of its styling. And while it has been a little bit different than we found in the traditional SUV, that look has maybe gotten a little stagnant over the years, although we are expecting an update, just when we don't quite know. However, the Ioniq 5 came right out the gate with a very good look that hasn't at this point received an update, but honestly I don't think it needs to. And that retro futuristic look has I think, done pretty well over the years, and we get a lot more retro looks as not just the Ioniq lineup, but some of these other models coming out. I just think this has done a really good job of balancing that act. When it comes to the tech inside, both of these are pretty loaded. You're going to find a larger screen over in the Tesla, but you're only going to find one of them. And the Ioniq 5 is going to have two, and ultimately I think some more usable screen real estate, but it is going to feel more conventional. Although that conventional is kind of a relative concept at this point, because everything has, well, felt more electrified. And the space in there is very open. But the fact that you have more buttons and knobs than you find in the Model Y is going to be a pro for some and a con for others. One thing you will find in the Hyundai that you definitely won't in any Tesla is going to be Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, though those are still wired, which is a bit of a bummer. They do exist, and that is going to be a plus for a lot of folks, myself included. Although I do own a Tesla and I have managed without it, I appreciate the ability to hop in any Hyundai, plug my phone in, and have the same sort of screen experience as I did in any other make and model that I may have just come out of. One argument against the Tesla has been how it rides, and the Tesla formula from the very beginning has been a tighter suspension setup than we've found in a lot of your run-of-the-mill competitive internal combustion vehicles. And the Ioniq is going to swing on the other side of it. Not too far, but definitely a more comfortable and compliant ride than we get in the Model Y. That does mean, depending on how you define driving dynamics, or sportiness, or comfort, or responsiveness, of handling, you are going to kind of weigh one way or the other. But I have to say that the Ioniq is going to feel on the more comfortable end, and the Tesla is going to feel on the sportier end, if not slightly more punishing. On the top end of the Ioniq 5, you do get more range, but you don't get anywhere near the same performance of the performance Model Y. So bang for the buck, the Tesla, well, it shows one of the reasons it has been one of the sales leaders, and that's because it's good value for the dollar. And these are all eligible for that federal tax credit, which certainly helps in the comparison. And admittedly was part of the reason I went with a Tesla instead of a Hyundai, because that's what it came down to for me. Sticking to the sportier side of things, let's go ahead and look over at the Mustang Mach-E, which is definitely a different shape than we find with some of the others, being a little bit more coupe and wagon-like. It's also going to be on the more muscular end. So a lot of that is going to come down to personal preference, and while it's not a Mustang, it does feel the most pony car of every crossover on the market today. If you want to go boy racer, the Mach-E now has a rally trim, which gives you things like bright white wheels and a big spoiler, but the Ioniq 5N is also going to be sort of a boy racer competition, though more expensive and more on-road performance oriented. When it comes to the layout of things and what the vehicles come equipped with, one thing that you're going to find in the Ford that you won't find in the Hyundai is going to be, well, hands-free driving. Though Blue Cruise may not be the absolute best system, the Mustang Mach-E comes out with Blue Cruise 1.3, and that's going to be, between these two, the only one where you can actually take your hands off the wheel, though it's not our favorite hands-free driving system in the segment, and we'll get to that as we get to some of the other options. Now, in the good news for the Mustang, you can get a more comfortable than less comfortable option. You just have to pay for the performance model, where you get the MagneRide shocks, and that's going to give you a much more compliant ride, especially when you hit some tricky road surfaces. But day-to-day driving, you are probably going to find, well, things to be a little bit easier on your back if you're driving that Ioniq 5. And I think, again, for a lot of these folks, if you're coming from something like a muscle car, you're going to be willing to go ahead and make some of those compromises. But if you're coming out of something like a CR-V or a RAV4 and you're looking for that similar experience, you'll probably lean towards the Ioniq 5 and not be disappointed when you get there. One of the larger standouts between these two is going to be in how far you go with the electricity you put in, and that's going to be a pretty clear winner with the Ioniq 5. Not only is it going to be more efficient day-to-day driving, it's also going to be faster charging. And that is going to add up, although the Mustang is at this moment able to access the Tesla supercharger network, meaning that those charging stops might be easier to access. As long as you're at the right station, you will definitely be there at a shorter period of time if you're driving the Ioniq 5. If the bottom line point of entry cost is super critical and you need something larger than, say, a Nissan Leaf or a Hyundai Kona EV, or you're really looking to get all-wheel drive as affordably as you can, then that would be one of the reasons to look at the ID4. And it's not going to be an uncomfortable ride, and it is going to have a number of features. For example, you can get massaging seats, but it's not great massaging seats. So it technically exists, but it doesn't really hold up to, well, other competitor massaging seats. which is not to say that all of these options have it, because to my mind, I think the ID4 is the only one of this list. But the point stands that it's not really going to excel at any of those, and it's just going to be, I don't want to say mediocre, but pretty middle of the road as far as versus other competition. That means that when you compare that to the Ioniq 5, you're going to get faster charging, better range, better efficiency, definitely a more dynamic drive, and overall the styling I think is a lot more appealing for the Ioniq 5 because the ID4 has gone a very, very safe direction. Of all of the competitors available, I think the Equinox is going to be one of the most interesting, especially when it comes head-to-head and how those sales numbers do once that Equinox is on lots and has had time to, let's say, settle in. You can do a lot with your Equinox, and there are different ways to order it. Front-wheel drive, all-wheel drive, different power outputs, different ranges, obviously, and quite a few packages that makes this pretty appealing, and also the point of entry is on the lower end of things. I also think Chevy has done a really good job with the styling here, and while I personally would probably still lean towards something like the Ioniq 5, I do think a number of folks are going to find that Equinox quite attractive, so I definitely give it the plus in that column. The other thing that it has that you don't find on any of these other models listed except for the Mustang Mach-E is Super Cruise, so your hands-free driving assist. And Super Cruise is our favorite hands-off-the-wheel driving system, and it just keeps getting better and better. The fact that you can do this in a car that has an entry price as low as it does is honestly a great option, especially if you do a lot of driving, because that's where Super Cruise is going to take some of the effort and fatigue that you would get on a longer road trip or a lot of time behind the wheel off of the driver itself, and you don't have to buy an incredibly expensive vehicle to go ahead and get that option. Now, I haven't been behind the wheel of the Equinox myself, but I talked to Alex ahead of time, and he said while it's a fine driver, the Ioniq 5 has definitely got the upper hand. As far as I'm concerned, Hyundai has been on an absolute hot streak when it comes to electric vehicles. And it's not just Hyundai. Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis have all put together pretty strong offerings. And as you may have noticed, the EV6 is not on this list because between the two, there isn't a whole lot between them. A lot of that's going to come down to personal style preference or what one may have a better deal on the lot just the day that you go to take a look. Even though we didn't see a whole lot of changes to this model, it still comes through as a practical, fun to drive, comfortable place to be, all at an affordable price. Like I said, it matches up pretty well with not only everything on the list, but just about everything that you can compare it to. And you do get some of those additional benefits like faster charging as long as you're at the right station, and a styling that, whether it's your thing or not, it's definitely distinct. And for a lot of folks, you're looking for not the run-of-the-mill electric car bubbly look, and this definitely goes the opposite direction. There aren't a whole lot of downsides, which is why this has been as popular as it is. But I will say that it's got more power than it does grip, and if you want to get it into the twisties, you do have to make sure you remember that this is not the performance model. That one will act and drive differently. This one does still have a pretty solid limit. And if you're going to compare it to something like the EV6, side by side, well, again, on paper they do a lot of things similar, but when you get into the interior, some of the button and switch arrangements, those are going to be probably a strong preference one or the other, but it might not match maybe the exterior option that you like, or if you want different seats, you're not going to find that sort of customizability or option list over in the Ioniq 5 that you might over there in the EV6. Of all those models listed, let me know if the Ioniq 5 is the one that's the highest on your shopping list, or if I missed something, let me know down in the comment section below. If you have any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to leave those as well. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, all those social places, and we'll see you down the road.